Welcome back to Reality Asserts Itself on the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay. We're continuing our series with Sabah Alnasseri. Thanks for joining us again.
Pleasure.
So, one more time. Sabah was born in Basra, Iraq. He teaches at the Political Science Department at York University in Toronto. His most recent book is Arab Revolutions and Beyond, the Middle East and Reverberations in the Americas.
Right.
Paint a picture of where we're at now in Iraq. From what I know, the Americans, number one, concocted a weapons of mass destruction argument that they knew was false in order to go in.
Right.
They go in, one would think, with the objective to overthrow Saddam and put in a pro-American government and get hold of the oil resources.
Right.
Well, they're successful in overthrowing Saddam. They get a government that's almost more pro-Iranian than it is pro-American.
Right.
And they don't have as much, anywhere near the control over Iraqi oil as they wanted.
Bases, yes.
So what do they want now? Obama's strategy was kind of stay out and not get embroiled again. These guys, meaning Trump and gang, and the Saudis and gang and others, they don't seem so reluctant to get involved.
Right. The U.S. is trying to bring on board all these regional powers like Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, etc., and mobilize them under the cover of fighting ISIS. That's the manifest objective, fighting ISIS.
It's also an actual fight, is it not?
It is, but it is not the real objective. Because, if you look at how the U.S. conducted the war against ISIS in Iraq and Syria, it's anything but clear cut. It's contradictory. On the one hand, in Syria, they support forces that actually, help ISIS. In Iraq, they support the Iraqi army against ISIS. So they follow different objectives in different countries in Iraq and Syria. And I said once on the Real News that when war becomes permanent, justification and license become contingent, depending on the situation. So here, everybody agrees, even Iran, in the fight against ISIS. But that's the difference now between the Obama administration and the Trump administration, that it wants everybody on board except for Iran against ISIS. So that means to lead the war much more directly compared to Obama, increase the troop in Iraq, and build military bases, and have an influence on how things are run in Mosul, because they want to determine and decide the post so-called liberation of Mosul scenario, how things will be organized after that. And the U.S. wants to have more say in the internal politics of Iraq than Iran. So that's the difference now. There's a shift in the sense of there are intention to have a physical and a political presence in Iraq compared to the few years before.
We were talking before we started the interview, and we're kind of, I don't know, game theory or whatever you call it. If you're big oil companies and you are sitting on several $1 trillion worth of oil sitting in the ground, although much of it is expensive to get out, and you've got all this sweet
abundant
crude
oil
in Iraq that's easy to get out, Saudi style. And you don't have direct control over it. And then you add another factor, which seems very important. It seems to me every time one talks about anything these days, especially if you're talking about oil, you have to talk about climate change. And the oil companies have to know that they have, 20 years, 10 years, someday they're speculating 30 years, before the world simply is going to turn off the oil tap because climate change is far too serious. Now, anyone that knows much about what the scientists are saying, 20 or 30 years is a disaster.
True.
And it's likely, if unless we're heading into, apocalypse, and we might be, the people of the world are going to demand fossil fuel close down a heck of a lot earlier, which makes it even more desperate, if you want, for oil companies to quickly make as much money as they can. Which means you want two things. You get your hands on all the easy to get oil, which means Iraq is one of the most, maybe the most important untapped place with easy to get oil. And two, you want oil prices to go up. And there's nothing better than a good war to get oil prices up, regional volatility, instability, and two, get your hands on Iraqi oil. But what does that mean, get your hands on Iraqi oil? What does that look like?
That's a good point, because I think the difference now between the approach of the Bush administration and the Obama administration, but mostly the Bush administration, was they were pushing for the privatization of oil in Iraq. I think that the Trump administration now want the Iraqi government actually to keep the oil, centralize the oil, in a way nationalize the oil, because that's the easiest way for the U.S. corporation to access all these contracts to the oil.
Why didn't the privatization work in the way the Americans wanted it to work?
Again, at that time, as I said, even within these Shiite parties, even within the cabinet itself, there were pushbacks, because everybody considers the oil not only as a commodity in Iraq or, let's say, in Algeria and so on, but they look at it from a social welfare perspective. That is a source of legitimacy. The Ba'athists knew exactly what it meant. So if you don't want to, jeopardize your political project, be it a Shiite political project or whatever, you shouldn't privatize the oil. You should keep the oil, because that's the mechanism through which you can get the support and so on among the wider segment of the Iraqi population. And that's what happened. And there was a pushback against it from trade unions to MPs to extra institutional social movement, etc. There was no way they can privatize it. Now, how it played out then, and that's the problem, because of the corruption and because sometimes, unclear regulation and justification who has what to say in which field. You can see this in Kurdistan. The Kurdish government sells oil on its own without, negotiation with the central government, etc. It became so complicated that most of the oil corporation actually, they hesitated to invest there because of the corruption, unclear regulation, etc. So they did not trust that this situation will be stable enough for the next 10, 20, 30 years.
Tremendous anti-American sentiment.
Exactly. So there's no stabilities and planning for the next 10 to 20, 30 years. Now, the Trump administration wants to have these oil fields, or the future one, for the next 20, 30 years, to secure them in a contract. And the only way they can do it is through a centralized government in Iraq. That means the oil stays under the control of the Iraqi government, not privatized.
Okay, let me just play a little. I'm going to play a little clip we played earlier in the series. I'm going to play it again. This is Donald Trump speaking at the CIA, where he talks about how we should have seized the oil in the first place, and then he, as an aside, he says, and we may have a second chance. So here's that clip.
The old expression, to the victor belong the spoils. You remember I always used to say, keep the oil. I wasn't a fan of Iraq. I didn't want to go into Iraq. But I will tell you, when we were in, we got out wrong. And I always said, in addition to that, keep the oil. Now, I said it for economic reasons. But if you think about it, Mike, if we kept the oil, you probably wouldn't have ISIS, because that's where they made their money in the first place. So we should have kept the oil. But, okay. Maybe you'll have another chance. But the fact is, should have kept the oil.
So when Trump says, well, we may have a second chance, seizing the oil back in 2003, when there's a war, you're overthrowing a government, and you seize the oil fields. That's one thing. But it's a whole other thing now. You have a parliament. There's a government there. If they want that government to sort of centralize the oil, and you're saying that's sort of happening, then what does that mean? You're going to have a second chance to grab the oil. What's he talking about?
Well, institutionally, that would mean, I guess, is that the Abadi government will create a parallel institution, like an oil and gas council or whatever, right? And this council will decide about oil contracts without, recurring to the parliament. So they try to give this institution autonomy enough to not to be under the legislative assembly.
Because this parliament actually was a little democratic. It kept voting against what the Americans
especially
wanted.
the Sadrs are against it. The biggest force within the Shiite are the Sadrs who are against the American or the privatization of oil. So creating this parallel institution will ensure that decision around a contract of oil and so on will be sustained in the long term. But that's my guess that this will not work, because they tried this before in 2007 and it didn't work. So maybe they will try the same scenario again to make sure it is centralized on the one hand, but it is regulated by institutions that the U.S. can control, or U.S. Representative of corporation or whatever sit on the board of directory of these institutions to decide about these contracts.
Does that mean in some kind of collaboration with the Iraqi government or sections of, you send in American troops to guard refineries, guard pipelines, and wipe out any of the people that are opposing you? So you wipe out the forces that oppose this Americanization of the oil.
Right, and that's the new thing. Like before, 1950s, 60s, and so on, you didn't need the army, the American army, to secure oil contract for your corporation. Now you cannot pursue this project without the military. So you have oil and military, like how do you term this? An organic link between the two, like a symbiotic relationship. It is unimaginable to have access to oil through economic or legal or political means. You need the military apparatus.
And does this not then create a broad national front against the Americanization of Iraqi oil? I mean, you actually unites the Iraqi people against this new invasion.
Well, that's one of these misunderstanding of Iraq that led to all these disasters after 2003. The understanding that somehow these Shiite parties represent the majority of the Iraqis who are nominally Shiite, and that the Kurdish party represent the Kurdish population, right? But de facto, the Iraqi people, be them Shiite or Sunni, Arab or Kurd, since a decade now, realize that these parties don't represent anyone but themselves. They are so corrupt and so on. They don't trust them. And if there are really democratic election, none of these parties would win the election. So, and here's the misunderstanding that somehow if they secure the collaboration of the Kurdish party and the Shiite parties in Iraq, somehow they can ensure that the majority of the Iraqi population will be okay with it, right? And the rest of the Sunnis, maybe the Saudis will take care of that. They put it under the Saudi influence and would take care of that. And that's a misunderstanding. Again, this scenario of Trump administration in collaboration with Abadi could lead to the political, end of this Shiite project in Iraq. So that's why I think that they will be pushed.
Project, you mean this current form of government?
The dominant governance,
Frankly, it's a government which is an American-Iranian co-production.
Yes, and that could mean, in a worst-case scenario, from the perspective of the U.S., that this is the end of this project. That you have much more nationalist figure, dominating the political scene than compared, let's say, to a few years ago.
Well, given that these are much the same people that totally miscalculated in 2003, there's no reason to think they won't totally miscalculate again.
And the U.S. knew this in 2009 when there were relatively free election. The so-called Shiite community in the South did not vote for al-Maliki. They voted for Alawi, who was an ex-Ba'athist. He won the election. But it was the U.S. Embassy who nominated Maliki to be Minister President, contra the popular vote. So they knew this at that time. This is a very precarious situation, and we cannot rely on this, relative nominal majority of Iraq, and these parties somehow they can control them, unless there's a new scenario now to ensure that not only the Shiite but also the Sunni political forces in Iraq are on board in this scenario. So this is something I don't know how they will manage to do this, because you can see it in the battle for Mosul. There was some arrangement between the U.S. and Abadi around the Shiite militias and so on, that compared to Fallujah, Al-Anbar, Tikrit, they don't enter the city of Mosul. The second biggest city in Iraq, mostly Sunni population, they keep the Shiite militias outside of the city, and they use mostly the Iraqi army and so on, right? In order not to sectarianize the whole thing, right? In order not to provoke Turkey too, etc. So you can see there was some sort of arrangement now to appease to an appeal to the Sunni population to be on board in this new U.S. project. And I think the promise is that Abadi would tell to the Sunni and the Shiite that we will have a massive investment of the United States and reconstruction and infrastructure and all this.
That worked out well for Afghanistan.
Yeah, and so exactly, and that's why
lots of promises of reconstruction there.
It's easy to promise these things, but then again, not least corruption will stand in the way whatever you think you want to do. So all this is a very speculative scenario that if it materialize, would mean a long-term instability. And if it didn't materialize, it create unnecessary, conflict and maybe a war with Iran. So either way, I don't see how this would lead to some sort of rehabilitation of the U.S. Presence in the region and its dominance, which the U.S. actually lost years ago. I don't see how this would work.
If you look at this, this fossil fuel government called the Trump administration, and maybe it's just about a short-term win, short-term profits, and damn what comes next.
Yeah, I mean, you have two logics here. You were talking about the environmental one, right? You have two logics. One of the short-term profitability of capital. They don't care about the environment. If they can secure these oil fields for them in the long run, and can send private security company to protect them, just like when you go to Congo and so on, and you will see you have private security companies controlling the diamonds, oil, gold mines, and so on, excluding the whole population from it, and just extract whatever they want, right? But that's very costly. That means you will have to increase the budget for the military and security enormously in the long run, and not just in the short term. Yeah. So again, this would create a new conflict scenario within the U.S. itself. What is the priority here? Is to satisfy the need of the American people, create jobs, etc., or to invest heavily in this speculative scenario, militarizing the whole conflict, and you don't really know what the outcome would be. So again, as you said, maybe they don't care about the long-term implication of that, as long as they can secure it and make profit in the short term, and then whatever social, environmental disaster, or the outcome of environment, they just tell the Iraqi to take care of it. They don't take any responsibilities. So it's a risky scenario for not only for the U.S. but also for the Iraqi government and whoever ally with them. I think that's why they need the Saudi more than ever in this scenario, right?
Yeah, the Saudi has to manage
because this. You see, if you look at Iran, 1979, Shah was gone. The most loyal ally of the United States was gone. In 2011, with the Arab Revolution, Mubarak was gone. Again, Egypt was an ally of the United States, was gone. So the only stable ally in the region since the Second World War is Saudi Arabia. Of course, after that, with the creation of Israel, it became Israel. But before that was already Saudi Arabia. So that's the only, actually,
And if they dress this whole strategy up so that the focus, all the rhetoric and everything is anti-Iranian, they're going to have most of the leadership of the Democratic Party on board.
Yeah.
The Chuck Schumers and all this. They'll be out there cheering anything against Iran. Right. Schumer runs in support of it.
Yeah. Yes. And just to confirm what I was saying before, the Saudis, few weeks ago, for the first time since years, they opened up their embassy in Baghdad again, right? And they were, in some sort of friendly relationship with the Abbasi government. So you ask yourself why they're doing this now. So in a way, the Trump administration is pushing for the Iraqi government to be much more in line with the Saudi project than with the Iranian one. Because if you want to, as I said, encircle or whatever, threaten, attack Iran, you need to have not only the Saudis and the Egyptian, whatever, the Gulf, you need also Iraq to be on board, right? And so again, the Saudis play a prominent role here.
For sure. And as we were saying earlier, maybe, the big objective is not, because it's really not possible to overthrow the Iranian regime, is to at least neutralize them so you have a freer hand in Iraq.
Right. Agree?
Ain't good for the people.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, I know I said this was the last segment, but it's not. We're going to do one more segment because Sabah has a new book out and has a lot to do with the issue of the people's revolutions, the Arab Spring. And we're going to talk about that in relation to Iraq as well as more generally. So one more segment with Sabah Alnasseri on Reality Asserts Itself. Please join us.